Frances Okafor found the letter on a Sunday afternoon in March while she was going through her father's clothes. Not looking for it, she had not known it existed. She was going through the clothes because her father had been dead for 6 weeks, and because 6 weeks was approximately the length of time it had taken her to reach the point where going through the clothes was possible, rather than the point where it remained impossible. And because the clothes were in the wardrobe of the small apartment on Birch Street, where her father had lived for the last 11 years of his life, and which needed to be cleared before the end of the month. Her father's name was Joseph. He had been 81 years old and had died on a Thursday morning in January, in the specific way of people who had been managing a heart condition for years and who died when the management reached its limit, which the doctors had warned was coming, and which had come on a Thursday morning while Joseph was apparently making tea in the kitchen of the Birch Street apartment, and had sat down on the kitchen chair and had not gotten up again. Della, the neighbor in the apartment below, had heard the chair and then heard nothing else, and had knocked at 6 p.m. and found the door unlocked, and had called the ambulance, and then had called Frances, who was the only person left to call. Frances was 60 years old. She had been divorced for 4 months, which was recent enough that the divorce and its implications were still in the process of settling into the shape they were going to take permanently, rather than the provisional shape they took while the legal process was still ongoing and the financial consequences were still being established. Her husband of 22 years, a man named David, who was an architect and who had met someone during the previous year's conference season and had handled the telling of it with the specific consideration of someone who wanted the process to be clean rather than the outcome to be different. The divorce had been technically fair. David was not a vindictive man, and he had not tried to be difficult. The house had been sold, and the proceeds split according to the agreement their lawyers had reached. Frances had walked away with enough to cover a rental for 2 years, and a financial cushion that was adequate for a person managing 1 life rather than 2, but that was not generous, not by the standard of 22 years of shared life and the specific contributions she had made to it. She was renting a 1-bedroom apartment in a different part of the city from the house she had lived in with David. She was working 3 days a week as an accounts manager for a small import business, a position she had returned to 7 years ago when she had decided that being at home full-time was not working for her, regardless of what it did for David's schedule, and which paid adequately, and which she was grateful for, and which did not cover everything she needed it to cover. Her father had been the person she called when things were difficult, not because he had resources to offer, because Joseph Okafor had been a man of modest circumstances throughout his life, a retired postal worker who had lived carefully and without complaint on a pension that was sufficient for one person living simply in a small apartment on Birch Street. He had not been able to offer money. He had been able to offer the specific quality of attention that her father had always offered, which was the complete and unhurried presence of a man who considered what you said before he responded to it, and who had never, in Frances's memory, made her feel that the time she was taking was time he begrudged. He had died 4 months after the divorce papers were signed, and Frances had lost both things in the same season, and the combination of those losses had a quality she did not have a word for. Something beyond sad, in the way that certain experiences were beyond the vocabulary available for them. She was going through his clothes because the end of the month was coming, and because doing the work was the only way through it. and because her father had been a practical man who would have agreed with that assessment. The jacket was a gray wool jacket that Joseph had owned for at least 15 years. Frances remembered it from visits and from photographs, and from the specific association of certain garments with certain people that happened over years of seeing someone in a thing so often that the thing became part of how you saw the person. She lifted it from the wardrobe and held it for a moment, and then began checking the pockets, the way you checked a garment's pockets before you decided what to do with it. The right outside pocket was empty. The left outside pocket had a folded receipt from a grocery store dated 3 months before his death, and a single mint in a cellophane wrapper. The inside breast pocket had the letter. She felt it before she saw it, the specific slight thickness of folded paper in a pocket, and she reached in and took it out and looked at it. It was an envelope, not sealed. The flap was tucked in rather than gummed down, the way her father had always stored papers he wanted to keep accessible, which was a habit she recognized, and which told her the letter had been placed in the pocket intentionally rather than forgotten. Her name was written on the front of the envelope in her father's handwriting. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, written in Joseph's handwriting, which was the careful handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship in the Nigerian secondary school he had attended before coming to England at 22, and who had maintained that penmanship throughout his life as the specific kind of discipline that had been given to him, and that he had continued to apply because continuing to apply it felt like a form of respect for the teaching. She read the first page, then she read the second. By the third page, she had stopped reading in the sequential way and was reading with the focused, total attention of someone whose understanding of what they were holding was changing with each paragraph, and who needed to slow down rather than rush to keep up with the change. She read the 4th page. She sat with the 4 pages in her hands and looked at the window of the Birch Street apartment, the view of the street below, and the gray March sky above it. Her father had written the letter 18 months before his death. She could tell this from the date at the top of the first page, which was September of the previous year, and from several references in the text to things that had been happening at that time. He had written it after a conversation with his doctor that had told him the heart condition was progressing in a direction that made the future shorter than the past, and that he should attend to the things he wanted to attend to. He had attended to this. The letter began with the things fathers wrote in letters to daughters who might read them after the father was gone. The expressions of love and pride, and the specific things he had found impossible to say in person, not because he did not feel them, but because saying them would have made the conversations they belonged to into something different than what they needed to be. Frances read this section with the full weight of her grief and kept reading. The letter then moved to something she had not expected. Her father wrote about land. He wrote about land in Nigeria, specifically in the region of Enugu State, where his family had been from, and where he had grown up before leaving at 22. He wrote about his own father, Frances's grandfather Emmanuel, who had been a farmer and who had owned land in the family's home village, in the way that land had been owned in that region in that era, through a combination of formal title and communal recognition that was different from the European property law system, but that was real, and that had legal standing under the customary land tenure arrangements that had been formally recognized in Nigerian law. Emmanuel had owned approximately 12 acres of farmland on the edge of the village, which he had worked for 30 years, and which had passed to Joseph upon Emmanuel's death in 1987, in the way that land passed in that family. Through the understanding of the family and the recognition of the community, and a documentation that was not a formal deed in the Western sense, but that was recorded in the customary land registry of the local government area. Joseph had left Nigeria before his father died and had not returned to live there. When Emmanuel died and the land passed to him, he had been in England for 20 years with a family and a life that was not in Enugu State, and the land had remained in the village under the management of Emmanuel's younger brother David, Francis's great uncle, who had farmed a portion of it and left the rest fallow, and who had died in 2008, leaving the management question unresolved. Joseph had done nothing with the land because doing something with it had required money and time and attention and the specific knowledge of how to navigate the Nigerian land administration system from England. And because none of those things had been available in the quantities required during the years of raising children and managing a modest income, and being the practical man that Joseph had been. But he had not lost track of it. The letter described, in the careful, sequential way of a man who organized information, what Joseph knew about the land, its location, the registration in the local government area's customary land records, the family documents he had kept in a folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, the names of the people in the village he had stayed in contact with over the years, and the name of a lawyer in Enugu City named Solomon Eze, who had written to Joseph 2 years before the letter was written, to inform him that the land's status had come to the local government's attention in the context of a regional development assessment, and that there were questions about the title that needed to be addressed. Joseph had written to Solomon Eze. The correspondence was in the folder in the bottom drawer of the desk. He had not told Francis about any of this. The letter explained why. He wrote that he had not told her because for most of the years since Emmanuel's death, the land had seemed like a complication rather than an asset, a responsibility attached to a place he had left and could not easily return to. And he had not wanted to burden her with a complication when she had her own life to manage. He wrote that he had not told her because he was not certain of the land's current status and did not want to create expectations about something he could not verify. He wrote that he had not told her because he was a man who found it easier to manage things quietly than to share the managing, which he acknowledged was not always the right approach, and which he was attempting to correct by writing the letter, rather than taking the knowledge with him. He wrote that when Solomon Eze had written to him 2 years earlier, the context had been a regional infrastructure development that was being planned in Enugu State, a development that involved roads and commercial investment, and the specific kind of activity that changed the value of land in ways that farmland on the edge of a village in 1987 had not anticipated, and that farmland in the same location in the current period might reasonably reflect. He wrote that he was leaving her the folder and the correspondence and the knowledge and the name Solomon Eze, and that he believed, though he could not be certain, that what she found in the folder when she opened it might be more significant than a 12-acre plot of fallow farmland suggested. He wrote that he was sorry he had not handled it better and earlier. He wrote that he loved her and that he was proud of her, and that he had always known she was the one who would know what to do with difficult things. He wrote that the folder was in the bottom drawer of the desk. She put the letter down on the bed and looked at the desk in the corner of the bedroom. She crossed to it and opened the bottom drawer. The folder was there. She took the folder to Carmen's kitchen table. She had no Carmen. She was not in her sister's apartment. She took the folder to the kitchen table of the Birch Street apartment, and she cleared a space among the boxes she had been packing, and she opened it. The folder contained the family documents Joseph had described. The original customary land registration records from 1962, when Emanuel had formally registered the land with the local government area, written in Igbo with English annotations that her father had added. A survey document from 1978 that described the land's boundaries with the specific measurements of a professional survey. Emanuel's death certificate. The document of transmission that established Joseph's inheritance of the land under customary law, signed by the village elders and the local government area representative, and the correspondence with Solomon Eze. She read the correspondence from the beginning. Solomon Eze had written first in a letter that was professional and specific, and that demonstrated the specific legal knowledge of a property lawyer who understood both the customary tenure system and the formal legal framework that had been developed to interact with it. He had written to inform Joseph that the Enugu state government had published a development corridor notice the previous year that identified a road and commercial development zone in the region, and that Joseph's land was within the affected area. He wrote that land within the development corridor had two possible outcomes. If the development proceeded as planned, the land would be subject to compulsory acquisition by the state under the Land Use Act, which provided for compensation to the registered owner. The compensation rates for land within active development corridors had been the subject of significant legal development in recent years, and the rates for commercial adjacent land were substantially higher than the historical rates that had made compulsory acquisition essentially confiscatory. He wrote that if the land was developed privately before the corridor was activated, the commercial value reflected by the development corridor classification would make it significantly more attractive to investors than farmland without that classification had been previously. He wrote that in either case, the key question was the current status of the title, which needed to be formally verified and, if necessary, clarified through the customary land court before either option could be pursued. He wrote that he was able to assist with the title verification and the subsequent process in whichever direction Joseph wished to pursue. Joseph had written back. His letter was in the folder, a copy in his handwriting. He had confirmed his ownership and expressed interest in understanding the process further, and asked Solomon Eze to proceed with the title verification. Solomon Eze had written back with the title verification results, which confirmed the registration and established the current legal status of the land under the customary tenure system. He had written about the development corridor and what it meant for the land's value in terms that were careful and hedged in the way of a lawyer who understood that land valuations were not guarantees, but that conveyed a range of figures that Francis read twice. The most recent letter in the correspondence was from 8 months before Joseph's death. Solomon Eze had written to say that the development corridor had been formally activated, which meant that the state's acquisition process had begun, and that Joseph would be contacted formally by the State Development Authority within a period he estimated at 6 to 18 months from the activation date. He wrote that the compensation framework that applied to activated corridor land had been updated by a court decision the previous year, and that the rates applicable to Joseph's land, given its classification and location, were substantially higher than they would have been under the previous framework. He wrote the range of figures he expected the compensation to fall within. Frances looked at the range. She looked at it for a long time. She read it again. She put the letter down on the kitchen table of the Birch Street apartment and looked at the window and the March sky and the street below. Her father had been a postal worker who had lived carefully in a small apartment on Birch Street for 11 years and who had died making tea on a Thursday morning in January without telling anyone about the land in Enugu State or the development corridor, or the correspondence with Solomon Eze. He had told her, in a letter in the inside breast pocket of a gray wool jacket in his wardrobe. He had written that he believed she was the one who would know what to do with difficult things. She picked up her phone. She searched for international calling rates to Nigeria. She found Solomon Eze's contact information in the most recent letter, a phone number and an email address, written in the professional format of a lawyer who expected to be contacted and had made that easy. She wrote an email. She wrote it with the attention she brought to things that mattered, which was the attention of a woman who had spent 30 years being organized and careful and capable in the service of a shared life, and who had those qualities available for her own use now without qualification or condition. She told Solomon Eze who she was. She told him her father had died in January and that she had found the folder and the correspondence today. She told him she was the heir to the estate and she was writing to establish contact and to understand the current status of the matter and the next steps that the situation required. She said she was available to speak by phone at whatever time suited him, given the time difference, and that she was ready to begin addressing whatever the situation required without delay. She read the email through once. She sent it. She put the phone down on the kitchen table beside the folder that her father had kept in the bottom drawer of his desk for reasons he had explained in 4 pages of careful penmanship in a letter he had left in the inside breast pocket of a gray wool jacket. She looked at the boxes around the apartment, the clothes still in the wardrobe, the books still on the shelves, the life of a careful man still in the process of being gathered and decided about. She thought about Joseph sitting down on the kitchen chair on a Thursday morning and not getting up. She thought about him writing the letter 18 months before that and putting it in the pocket of the jacket and leaving it there, waiting for the morning when his daughter would be going through his clothes with the patient grief of people who manage difficult things by doing what needed to be done. He had known she would find it. He had always known she was the one who would know what to do. She picked up the folder and went back to the wardrobe. She had clothes to finish going through, and boxes to fill, and a month in to meet, and an email response to wait for, and a process to begin that was going to require exactly the qualities she had been applying to other people's lives for 30 years, and that she was applying now for the first time with nothing divided and nothing shared and nothing qualified, entirely to her own. She took the next jacket from the wardrobe. She checked the pockets. There was nothing in them. There did not need to be. The important thing was already on the kitchen table. She folded the jacket and kept going.